All right, good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the March meeting of the Planning Commission. My name is Jenny V. Jolson. Thank you for being in attendance this evening, and hopefully you all have voted. If not, the polls are open till 8 p.m. Why don't you open us with a roll call for attendance, please?
Acosta?
Here.
Cammer?
Here.
Rodriguez?
Here.
Sarmiento?
Here.
Tavares?
Here.
Jones?
Here.
Beach Olson?
Here. Please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We'll move on to presentation and oral communications. This is the time set aside for members of the general public to address the Planning Commission on any items not on the agenda which are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Planning Commission. No action or discussion shall be taken on any item presented except that any commissioner may respond to statements made or questions asked or may ask questions for clarification. All matters of an administrative nature will be referred to by staff. All matters relating to Planning Commission will be noted in the minutes and may be scheduled for discussion at a future meeting or referred to staff for clarification and report. Any commissioner may place matters brought up under oral communications on a future agenda. All speakers are asked to fill out a blue card and leave it at the podium. Announce your name and address in order to obtain an accurate record for the minutes. Are there any members of the public who would like to address the commission this evening? Seeing none, I'll bring it back to the commission for oral communications. Are there any communications from the commissioners? Yes, Commissioner Kammer.
I have several things. The first one is the Planning Commission, the City Council adopted Vision Zero, the final plan for Vision Zero. And so this morning we had a South County Bicycle and Pedestrian Work Group meeting, and we are going forward with looking at the Vision Zero plan and looking at pieces of that plan to implement along the way. So that is the group that, it's open to the public. Our meetings are every other month. The next one will be in May, the first Tuesday from 10:30 to 12 in the library. The second thing I wanted to make sure people knew about, a couple things. National Night Out, even though it's not until August, National Night Out is a good way to get your neighbors together and plan for a fun night with support of the city. And you will get visits from the fire department, the police. Kids get stickers. Often they bring the fire trucks and the police cars, and you just get to meet your neighbors and declare that you have a safe and cohesive neighborhood. And National Night Out is a way to get to know your neighbors and really communicate with them and make sure that you know who's who and whose car is that, and talk about maybe things that have been happening in your neighborhood. It's a really great way to get to know your neighbors and to get together. And in conjunction with that sort of thing, we have something that is available through the city, which is called the Neighborhood Traffic Plan. And I know people in the City Council talked about this in the February 25th meeting. And the Neighborhood Traffic Plan is a plan that enables neighbors to become involved with the improvement process for addressing concerns about speeding and other traffic complaints in their neighborhood. And any neighborhood can submit a neighborhood traffic plan if they have concerns about speeding or traffic in their neighborhood. You would probably the way you would do this is you would contact your council member in your district, or you could also look at it's on the city website. You would just type in under the search box, Neighborhood Traffic Plan. The last thing is, I was wondering if staff, if we could get, I'd like to request an update on the on housing in the city. So maybe the newer developments that are coming in are coming on for rent and sale, and then also for the housing element that's apparently going to council in later on this year. So if we could get a kind of a briefing, and that would be really great.
Any other oral communications? Yes, Commissioner Sarmiento.
Well, I would like to invite the public to come and join us this Friday at 4 o'clock at the Plaza to celebrate International Women's Day. This is an event that almost every country in the world celebrates the achievements and the progress and the contributions of women, and discuss the issues that women are facing locally, worldwide, and how we can support those efforts. We had a small grant from the Santa Cruz Arts Commission, and a lot of us participated and made some signs and some posters that we'll be exhibiting at the event on Friday. So come, dress warmly. It gets really cold by 5 o'clock. Hope to see you then.
Any other commissioners? All right. I believe we have a presentation on SB 743.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. I'm Justin Meek, Principal Planner for the City of Watsonville, and I will be giving you a presentation on Senate Bill 743. And for those that haven't kept track of all these bills, you can be forgiven. This was enacted a while ago. But that's part of the reason why the title of the slide. Are we there yet? This has been coming to us for a long time, for a number of fronts, not just because of this current law, but for a number of efforts that have been ongoing to try to accommodate better forms of land use that's more efficient, that's more compact, basically infill near transit. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in a moment. So I shared these slides in advance. Hopefully I had a chance to look it over. It's meant to be primarily a resource so that it can answer any number of questions that you or the public or the council may have for why this is coming before you today and what are the actions that are going to be needed moving forward. I'm going to touch on the law, the background on it, go over a brief description of LOS, what that is, what that means, why we're looking at VMT instead of LOS, and give some definitions for what the different performance metrics are and the implications they have for transportation analysis moving forward. Then I'm going to shift into a very technical discussion. I won't dive into it too deeply other than say that there's ongoing efforts that are being done by consultants that have been hired by the city as a joint effort with the county and other jurisdictions to inform the needed analysis that we need for shifting to this new metric of VMT, and then to highlight that the next step, what this is all leading up to, will be coming back before this body to make a recommendation to council on establishing new thresholds of significance per CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, on what will be transportation-related impacts for any and all projects moving forward. There's a lot, so bear with me. So we're there yet? What this is all about is changing the level of service and no longer using that as a metric for defining whether or not a transportation impact associated with a project is an impact at all. Instead, we're going to be looking at VMT, otherwise known as vehicle miles traveled, because the short version is it better aligns with actual environmental impacts associated with greenhouse gas emissions. This law was initially enacted, almost 7 years ago. In 2003, it took several years for the state to come up with a rulemaking guidance document for what metric will be selected and what will be the methodologies that are recommended for doing it. So that's what we've been working on since that time. It was adopted in 2018, and it also set a deadline for when thresholds will go into effect from changing over this paradigm of how we evaluate impacts from LOS to VMT, and that's shortly. This is in keeping with other efforts, and I alluded to this earlier. Darrell Steinberg, the senator who adopted SB 743, was also the same one that adopted, or drafted, I should say, for adoption, Senate Bill 375 back in 2008. If you recall, that bill is what is the reason why regional agencies, MPOs, such as AMBAG, marries transportation and housing planning at the same time and includes what's called the SCS, the Sustainable Community Strategies, as part of these regional plans. The whole point, again, is to look at transportation and housing together, believe it or not. They were separate efforts previously. It was only transportation previously as part of the MTP, and housing was primarily through the RENA process. And this marries the two, where you look at modeling what are the associated VMT, greenhouse gas, and greenhouse gas emissions associated with different kinds of land use scenarios, and what kind of things can be done to help reduce VMT and greenhouse gas emissions at the regional level. So that's the whole SCS process, and that's how it's consistent with that effort at the same time, because the overall objective is to not only encourage other modes of transportation, so not just single vehicles, single occupancy vehicles, but looking at how to encourage transit, bicycling, pedestrian, other modes. And with that, there's associated less greenhouse gas emissions with it. And the land use patterns for those kinds of developments, of course, are infill, not greenfield development, where you're looking at converting ag land or other areas that are outside of urban areas that, again, would in itself result in people having to travel further, and then you get the associated greenhouse gas emissions. This is all tied to traffic truism, that if you have more residents in a downtown area or near an urban area, you're going to get less driving in aggregate. And there's been lots of studies that have borne this out. Even in Santa Barbara, the recent efforts to foster more infill development show that they generates about half the trips if you have compact infill development versus more development at the periphery. So again, the purpose of this, of SB 743, is to change the transportation impact analysis per CEQA. The objectives are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote infill. And so the metrics that are being changed is moving away from how we maintain LOS, or level of service, at intersections or roadways, and to reducing trips, to reducing the vehicles miles traveled associated with projects. This is just mainly for your reference. It changes certain codes in the public resources codes that states that upon certification of the guidelines, which has been done, we can no longer use automotive delay, or LOS, for whether or not a project could have an environmental impact, and instead moves away from LOS to VMT. That's all that this slide says. As I mentioned before, it's intended to promote infill, but along those lines is how do we support transportation networks in total, not just for cars, but the overall networks. And looking at the diversity of land uses that can help foster that kind of mobility of getting around other than having to use a personal vehicle. So we're moving away from looking at what's the congestion at an intersection along a roadway, and looking more on what are the overall influence development has as overall automotive use at a citywide or regional level. Again, the objective is to have less per capita greenhouse gas emissions and to promote not just automotive, but multimodal or other forms of transportation as people do the things that they want to do in their daily lives. And just to make note that one of the other key focuses on this is to, as part of this info, have the expectation that there are a range of land uses near transit priority areas. And that's just a way of saying that we want to have a diversity of land uses so that people can do all the kinds of things readily, whether they live, work, play, go to school, shop, and so forth, in a way that's near one another so that they can get around by transit, for example. This is for the CEQA nerds up here on the Planning Commission. This is the actual amended language in the state guidelines. I just thought I'd throw it in there for you for your reference. And within that section, it also speaks to when it goes into effect. So that's formally included in the state guidelines that starting July 1st, we can no longer use LOS to evaluate whether that is, the city as lead agency, can determine an impact from a project based on congestion. So in terms of the implications, one of the things I just want to make notice is, yes, we can't use LOS for determining whether there's a significant impact. However, it does not preclude the city from using LOS for other purposes in terms of whether or not the city chooses to maintain LOS as a metric per our general plan for capital improvement projects or congestion management for other agencies, for the sake of what they want, how they want to address congestion on our network. So I just want to make sure you understand the distinction between CEQA and other policy documents that there's still discretion that the city has. But the takeaways, the three things I want you to understand is that first and foremost, the city as lead agency is prohibited from using automotive delay when determining significant impacts associated with projects. That the tool or the evaluation will now be based on VMT, and this goes into effect soon as of July 1st. And so moving forward, I'll be coming back before the Planning Commission probably May or June at the latest for a formal recommendation to council on what those new thresholds will be. So I want to have an opportunity for you to understand this and not have this surprise you at the very last minute. So how have we been doing this today? How did we get here today? In the past, transportation engineers and planners primarily looked at delay for obvious reasons. There's congestion on the roadways. People want to get to where they want to go more quickly, and that's where level of service comes into play. Simply put, it's a measure of traffic flow, and that gets turned into how much delay is on the road, and of course that reflects congestion. And it has been used to date as a metric for whether or not there's environmental impact per CEQA. And what would happen is you would look at a roadway, what's its current traffic flow, what's its given a grade, is it level of service B, C, D, for instance, and then look at the contribution that the project has towards that existing level of service and see whether or not that contribution to the existing delay on the roadway was significant. And there's different metrics that communities use. You may be aware that for Caltrans, the threshold was level of service D, and if you had just 0.1 second additional delay, that was a significant impact that triggered mitigation. Well, you can imagine that can be challenging to mitigate already congested roadways. And does it really reflect an environmental impact or just people's perceptions on how quickly they're going down the roadways? Other implications, and here's a quote by Jeffrey Tomlin. He's a principal with Nelson Nygaard. They're a transportation planning firm based in San Francisco, very well respected. He's written a number of articles, and this is a quote from one that he wrote a few years ago in ITE, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, noting that the over-reliance of level of service as the only indicator of success in our transportation system is one of the biggest obstacles to infill development. And also provided context for how and why LOS developed in the first place. It occurred primarily following the post-World War II era, where you saw a lot of suburban development, out-migration from city centers. And with that, there was a focus on personal automotives. They would become less expensive. People could afford homes further out. And so you saw this migration again out, and then people driving back into, say, city centers where they worked. And in that paradigm, it only made sense to accommodate people traveling far distances as quickly as possible. It, of course, is primarily and only a focus on drivers. The methodology is simply a matter of looking at the volume of traffic and what the capacity of the roadway, and then a quantitative score is given that is based on how that road is performing. If there's no delay and you have people traveling at speeds. In this case, it's the right column indicates if the typical speed is 85 percentile or greater, basically there's free-flowing traffic, it's LOS-A. Now, if you get all the way down to LOS-F, that means you have significant delay, maybe over a minute, and that the travel speeds are well below the 30th percentile. So a lot of congestion, a lot of stop-and-go traffic. And of course, with that, it implies that LOS-F is failing. This is a simple graphic showing what that looks like on a roadway. LOS-S, no cars. You can travel at the posted speed. There's really nothing to encumber you from traveling at whatever speed that you desire. Versus you can have a few more cars on the road, LOS-B, but you're still pretty free-flowing. C, you can start to feel the traffic. By D, it's getting a little bit more congested. E and F, you're going to start to experience significant delays. The main purpose of including this slide is just to highlight looking at, particularly an urban roadway, in utilizing LOS, what does it accomplish? It looks solely at whether or not traffic can flow through our community. It doesn't speak to anything in terms of transit ridership, what it feels like as a pedestrian or a bicyclist on the roadways. None of that factors into an LOS metric. And nor does it also speak to economic or the social vibrancy of the community, too. It's just whether or not traffic can freely flow through that area. So again, in looking at this auto-oriented style of measuring whether or not there is traffic delay, the question becomes, is LOS-A really better than LOS-F? And to help think of that, if you look at the top image, that's with no traffic on the roadway, that would be LOS-A, with nobody on the road, nobody on the street, versus a urban environment where you have lots of activity, lots of people, lots of traffic. That would be considered LOS-F. And that's sort of the one of the things I want to leave with you, and why there's been this shift from moving away from utilizing and relying on LOS solely and looking at other metrics, particularly from environmental perspectives, on what we want to accomplish. So key takeaways, first and foremost, LOS is a measure of traffic flow or delay. It's based in large part from the post-industrial era where there's a lot of suburban development and high auto ownership and the associated travel with that. It, of course, is important because it's been used and relied upon for traffic studies and associated impacts, and has shown to be an obstacle for appropriate infill in many communities. So now we're looking at transitioning away from LOS to VMT. And this reflects a paradigm shift. There's been a number of articles in a number of journals that have looked into this, including ITE, which is the standard bearer for looking at trip generation rates for projects. ITE stands for the Institute of Transportation Engineers. And in their own journal, they've explored this topic and about what it means to have means to rely on LOS, whether or not that there's other metrics, what's the purpose of it. Here's one example of one of those exploratory articles that noted that embedded in these performance measures themselves are our values. And based off of that, the kind of data that we use informs the decision making for what we want to accomplish. So are we looking to provide additional capacity, like as shown in this highway? If you're not familiar, that's the 405 outside the west side in Los Angeles. I think the Getty is off to the right somewhere. Versus looking at not just accommodating cars, but accommodating people and how they want to be able to travel. So here's a nice illustration that reflects, depending on your travel mode, it takes up a lot or little space on your roadways. So the number of people are all the same in these three images. It's just how they're getting about, whether in their bus, on bike, or in a car. And so depending on how we want to reflect what we want is how efficient the roadway is going to operate and how, there's different ways to go about measuring this. Now, a number of communities have already worked on implementing SB 743. They include everywhere from Pasadena, where they're one of the first, to Los Angeles. I'll note that Emeryville is on the list here too, because when they updated their general plan back in 2009, they also moved away from using LOS. So they formally said, we're not going to rely on LOS anymore for our transportation network. We're going to come up with a different hierarchy of transits for roadways. We're going to have some that are focused on cars, some focused on transit, and so forth. So they really were sort of trailblazing on thinking about looking at our overall transportation network and what we want to accomplish. The other examples are really mainly looking at VMT as a way to both comply with SB 743 and also looking at their transportation network at the same time. Even Caltrans is getting into the act. Just last month, they sent out a memorandum basically saying that they take this seriously and they're going to be complying with these new CEQA guidelines and to look out. It's coming soon. And just last week, they had a follow-up memorandum that stated that they will be following the state's advisory. This is OPR, the Office of Planning and Research, that I noted before, and following the methodology that's in there. So Caltrans is going to be utilizing the same approach, and they too will no longer be relying on level of service for evaluating land use project impacts. It's in the comment review period, so in case any of you want to comment, you have until March 30th to do so, or anybody else in the audience that's listening. Now, and so I've touched on this before, but I just want to make sure it's understood that one of the main reasons why VMT is, of course, the trips associated with long trips have more emissions and more greenhouse gas emissions, and so that's the nexus to the environmental impact. And the intent here is to accommodate and support transit-oriented development and, of course, transit in general by providing, if you have compact development near transit lines, you have more ridership. It goes hand in hand. And also, VMT is not a new concept in CEQA documents. There's already greenhouse gas emissions that are evaluated in other sections of say an EIR, or an initial study mitigated neg declaration. You look at the greenhouse gas emissions associated with new construction and so forth. So it's marrying those two. Now we're looking in the transportation section as well as the air quality sections of the same document. So it's consistent in that regards. As I mentioned before, VMT and greenhouse gas emissions are already looked at the regional level when AMBAG, for example, looks at their MTP SCS document, which they're looking to update recently. And sorry for using too many acronyms, but that's the Metropolitan Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy. These next series of slides, I don't want to go into detail. I mainly provide it for reference. There are a number of options and considerations that we'll be exploring as we move forward as part of that, but I wanted to make sure that you had this reference, so if need be, we can refer back to it. There are some benefits that I did want to highlight. As I mentioned before, if you had, say, a nice infill development, say in a downtown environment, and the roadways are already congested. This came up, for example, San Jose, when they were looking at putting mid-rise and high-rise developments downtown to accommodate more people to live in the downtown environment after people had moved out previously. They were having a really hard time, in part, because the CEQA documents were easily challenged, and they had to, every time they did a new project, they basically had to do an EIR because of transportation, and then have a statement of overriding considerations because the roads were already so congested. And so they looked at changing their thresholds to LOSE to say we're going to basically accept a lot of congestion, but it was just a way of highlighting that CEQA became a barrier for infill development. And you can imagine, if you have already your urban fabric, do you have any more capacity, or do you even want to widen the roads in the first place? And if you were, that would be costly not only for the city but the developer at the same time to try to accomplish those sort of things to, again, reduce environmental impacts. As I just noted on, it opened up a lot of projects to litigation, so this lightens the burden, and you can say thank you later, for being challenged in court for infill projects. It just removes transportation as one topic for being challenged moving forward. And also, again, we're switching the type of mitigations that would be advanced as part of addressing transportation impacts. So instead of, say, changing the configuration of an intersection to, say, widen it and do other sort of things to accommodate traffic flow through it, we can look at how to foster more mode shift, or how to foster people riding, taking transit, walking, and so forth. So the shift moves to mitigation measures and strategies that look at managing the overall demand for automobiles and encouraging other types of ways of getting about. I mentioned this before, but here's just a little bit more on the fact that it doesn't preclude it doesn't take away local authority on relying on LOS for other purposes in terms of our general plan and how we want to address congestion at certain intersections. That's still possible. It's just not done through CEQA anymore. And that's what this slide just highlights. I will say that the new focus will likely be not only just managing congestion and traffic volumes and how signals will operate. Those are still things that our Public Works Department will be looking at. But we won't be mitigating for LOS. We'll be looking at a whole range of ways, and it allows also for perhaps a more fuller discussion of looking at safety considerations rather than being forced to try to mitigate for how and whether an intersection operates at LOSD or LOSC. All right. So now what? What are we doing? What's been done? We've engaged in a countywide effort, so myself as well as representatives from all jurisdictions within the county, including Scotts Valley, Capitola, the city and county of Santa Cruz. We've been meeting for about a year now and sharing information and resources. Most recently, we've hired and shared costs on hiring a firm, Kimley Horn, to do the technical analysis needed, and that's what these next slides speak to. They're engaging in utilizing the travel demand model for the county and using that to estimate VMT per capita for residential, office, and so forth. So that baseline type of analysis is ongoing right now, and that can then allow us to understand what would be the impacts of setting our new thresholds and what will that mean for projects. And it has a lovely name. What we'll be developing is what's called a VMT calculator. And it's basically just a tool for estimating the number of miles traveled by a project, associated with a project. And we can use that to compare it to regional or citywide VMT on a per capita basis. And here's a nice little graphic to try to help demystify what we're talking about. So if you had like a home-based trip with a new subdivision, how far is it that the average person would travel to get to school or to go shopping or to go to work? Obviously, if that home is in the city limits, the distance that they're likely to have to travel is less, versus if it's way out in the county or somewhere far away, they're going to have to travel a lot further. And so when you start doing the analysis and add it all up, you get different VMTs associated with different kind of land uses in different locations, as well as just coming up with a generalized average on a per capita basis. And that's where the thresholds come into play. Actually, before I get to that, let me give you just some preliminary results. Obviously, we color-coded this where red is bad, green is good. The legend is really, really small, but the takeaway is if you have a project in any of the urbanized areas, whether it's Santa Cruz, Aptos, or Watsonville, for a residential type project, you're not looking at a high VMT. It's really what we're looking at is outside the urbanized areas in more rural county land where this becomes more of an issue, even for office development. So anything that's green is indicating that the location means you're likely to get a relatively low VMT on a per capita average because it makes sense. You're already in an urbanized area. The places that you need to go would not be as far as compared if you are further out in the county. here's a lovely slide, and hopefully I can explain it. The recommended thresholds that's come from the state speaks to setting that this new throughout. Again, we're throwing out LOS, all the LOS A, B, C, and D out the window. Instead, we're looking at, on a per capita basis, what is the existing VMT for, say, residents, and then setting a threshold at less than 15% below that threshold. Same kind of threshold for office. Retail, we're just looking at the net, whether or not there's a net increase. And the assumption there is that a lot of retail would be neighborhood serving. That if you have a new retail shop in town, people would be stopping there along their way. It'd be short trips. It's not going to be a net increase of a lot of trips or miles traveled if you're just doing your local shopping in town. This is not to be confused if you had a big box regional center. Entirely different kind of market, entirely different kind of draw of people from the region and associated trips. And I also noted here that transportation, so whether it's a public works projects or a Caltrans project and it's a roadway project, there's a number of other thresholds. This is stuff you don't need to, I'm not going to delve into, but there's a whole long laundry list of different kinds of projects and whether or not it will likely be an impact. And if you want to read the pages on it, Caltrans memo, I have a link to it later, goes into great detail. I won't bore you right now. One of the key takeaways on this, however, is that there's going to be screening thresholds. So based off of these metrics here, there's different ways to assess whether or not a project is likely going to have an impact in the first place and needs further evaluation. And this can be based on the size of the project, its location, so a mapping exercise, whether or not there's transit readily available and high quality transit is the expectation there, and whether or not the project itself is providing affordable housing, because that again is assumed to be a way to accommodate more people in urban areas and wouldn't have high trips associated with it. So moving forward, there's going to be a range of ways to screen out projects. Remember the map I showed previously, the red and green? Those are preliminary results. We're going to get final results soon, and that will screen out certain types of residential projects in those areas. They will not have to do any further analysis for VMT as part of a CEQA document moving forward. Likewise, if it's a small project, let's say it's a small housing project in the county, and it has less than 110 trips per day, which is equivalent to maybe a townhome project with maybe 20 units. So if you're about 20 units or less, give or take, then they too would not necessarily have to do a VMT analysis as part of the CEQA document for that project. Similarly, if it's local serving retail, and by this, the threshold is set around 50,000 square feet of space. That kind of development would be assumed to be local serving and it's not regional retail, and therefore no traffic analysis is needed for that. As I mentioned before, affordable housing and projects also near transit stops. However, there's a number of exceptions to this exemption, and this is something that CEQA folks like to do all the time. If there's excessive parking, if there's not a lot of intensity, if it's not otherwise consistent with the MTP's SES at the regional level, and if it replaces existing affordable housing, these are all red flags. And then a formal analysis for EMT would have to be done. And the idea here is FIR floor area ratio. That signifies a lot of development in an area. Anything less than that threshold is considered low density and not in keeping with compact, good, high-quality infill near transit. Doesn't foster the kind of ridership that they would be looking for. Moving forward, let's say you have a project, the Dunham VMT analysis, and there's potential impacts, and they need to reduce the vehicle miles traveled by reducing the trips. There's going to be a whole range of new strategies that are being developed, and associated with them are trip reduction expectations. So, for example, if you unbundle parking for new residential project, and that's where you have the home and the parking space as two different items with two separate costs. So this is how much it costs for the unit. This is how much it costs for the parking space. it sends a price signal to the new renter or homeowner that this is how much it costs for your parking space. Do you actually want to pay for it? So you can imagine sort of a mid-rise condominium project. They would have a choice to make. I do value this parking space, I will pay for it. Or really, I just want this home and I'll find other ways of getting around it. Again, it's an economic way of having a discussion on what you're willing to pay for. And there's a whole range of other things that have associated trip reductions, everything from providing more bike parking, doing traffic calming. These are the various categories of things that will be developed and included as mitigation measures for if a project is found to have a high VMT and needs to mitigate it by reducing the number of trips. There's going to be a range of options. I'm not going to go through every one of them, but I just want to let you know there is quite a few. They're under development right now, and we will be bringing them back to you as a laundry list, just so you're aware that that's forthcoming. This is an Excel spreadsheet on steroids. This is the VMT calculator that I alluded to before. This is one that was developed for San Jose, the city of San Jose, and we will likely have something for staff. This is mainly for staff and for developers to be able to estimate what the VMT associated with the project is, whether it's screened out, what are some of the TDM or transportation management strategies I talked to before could be implemented to get those trips and that VMT down into an acceptable level. So this is just to show you what we're going to be getting from these efforts and the tools that we're going to be utilizing moving forward. All right, so my last slide. The main takeaways is we have a regional effort that's ongoing right now. There's a lot of, it's been a long process, but we're getting close to having all what we need for informing the thresholds that we'll be establishing. And then once that's ready, and again, we don't have a lot of time, but I expect we'll be back hopefully May, but no later than June, to bring forward the recommended thresholds for recommendation council. And so I understand that these slides have been shared with council just to keep them up to speed as well. And so that there's no surprises and these background information. Again, that's why this presentation is so long and has all this detail. Can address those questions up front. And last but not least, that last bullet point is just a note that, as I mentioned before, since CEQA is no longer going to be utilized for roadway improvement projects like widening the road, putting in signalized, that means it's not going to tie that into our city's capital improvement project moving forward. We still obviously will have one. We'll have a range of projects that we'll want to advance. As Maria spoke to council the other day, a lot of them have to do not with capacity building, but with safety in addition to congestion. So just want to end on that note. And if you have any, before I do that, there's a lot of resources out there. If you want more, or if you have trouble sleeping, read some of these. The first one, of course, is the Senate bill itself. There's OPR's page, has a wealth of information and a lot of technical information and background documents. You can get lost in there for days. The actual guidance, that's the third bullet point, and that's what ourselves, Caltrans, and others are utilizing for establishing what our new methodologies will be. Caltrans has just released and updated their website, so I provided that link as well. And then these last two by Farron Pierce and Nelson Nygaards. These are two leading transportation engineering and planning firms. They have very user-friendly, clear websites that also provide good information too. Last one. So that concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I will do my best to try to address them.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission?
Justin, can you review the timeline again? So it's coming to us and then it goes to council, but the state is requiring this by July 1st. Correct. So how does that work?
So that means moving forward, we can't. So up until now, and we've looked at CEQA documents, the the traffic section says, here's our threshold of significance, and it's based on LOS. If the project has an X contribution towards delay, it's a potentially significant impact. What are your mitigation measures? So for the last one that came before you, there was a little bit of delay at certain intersections at Main and Green Valley, for example, and the mitigation measure wasn't necessarily to widen the roadway, but to look at retiming the signals to accommodate traffic to go through it more quickly. Now, all that's out the window. We can't use that as a threshold anymore. We have to adopt new ones. And so it's a requirement that every lead agency, every city, every county adopt their own thresholds based on the guidance provided by the state. And by the state, I mean the Office of Planning and Research.
Okay, so the state guidelines will be kind of the minimum standard, and then the cities will take that and then adopt others.
Yes, they provide some recommendations. That was that slide that had the 15% and so forth. That's what they're recommending, that the states. And so for us to vary from that, we'd have to have good reason and substantial evidence for why we don't use that as our thresholds. So that's one of the things I'll be looking at with Kimberly Horn, is understanding what the implications are for adopting that. Again, the preliminary results suggest that there shouldn't be many implications. Most types of residential office projects and retail projects would be, in essence, exempt from doing a formal VMT analysis for the purpose of CEQA.
And then, so any projects that have already passed will not be subject to this metric for.
That's correct.
Okay. Just checking. Thank you.
Justin, does this change have also any sort of financial impact, meaning allocation of monies from the state for grant programs for new traffic studies, new traffic projects, anything like that?
Well, there are traffic studies that are required right now for, particularly if you're to understand what the effect on, say, State Route 152, Main Street, by Caltrans. That's an interesting question. Yeah, I would see that for most projects, it aligns with the guidance for a number of objectives for state funding. You know, whether you're talking about trying to accommodate infill development or promoting alternative modes of transportation, it's in keeping with that. So it won't make it harder to apply for those grants and get those grants.
Right.
But let's say you have a roadway project. I know for Caltrans, I was looking over their list, and a lot of them basically are saying you're not to do capacity enhancing, so basically no new lanes. There are some exceptions, like auxiliary lanes, where it's in between exits, and the expectation is it's for more safety, not capacity per se, and that's how they're framing it. But in general, we're not looking at making our roadways any wider moving forward. So there may be some implications there if there were jurisdictions or let alone Caltrans that wanted to accommodate that.
Yeah, I think because as I looked at this and thought about it, we have so many people that LOS would be a huge impact going from Watsonville to Santa Cruz, right? The vehicle miles traveled will be fairly high, and I didn't know if working with the county and the other cities in the county that are part of this, along with Caltrans, could open up monies for future projects to alleviate that VMT or bring that VMT level down to some more acceptable level.
I think you're going to see more and more a multimodal approach. So instead of just trying to make every road wider and wider and wider and seeing just more and more congestion, looking at how do we accommodate people's travel in a variety of ways by providing better transit, by providing better trail networks, and so on and so forth, and encouraging development near existing infrastructure, near existing high-quality transit line, rail lines, and so forth, in areas where, if you imagine living closer downtown, many of the activities or destinations that you like to visit are close to you. So do you actually need to get in the car in the first place? That's part of the thinking.
Thank you.
know how to ask this question, but I definitely like the idea that we should infill and make more services available in a smaller area than driving back and forth. But how would that work with the current employment supply, let's say? So if that's the goal, to have people live and work in this really close by, how do you think that's going to play out here in Watsonville? I don't know.
I think in every community, it's going to be, it's going to reflect the existing land use patterns. And so, as you both spoke to, there's more housing in Watsonville, and there's a greater proportion of jobs in Santa Cruz. And because of that, you have a lot of congestion along the Highway 1 corridor in the mornings into Santa Cruz and in the evenings back into Watsonville. And those sort of land use patterns and that traffic didn't happen overnight. And these changes are not going to be resolved overnight. These have been going on for decades. And so this is a way to shift these decisions on where we fund transportation projects and where do we encourage housing and jobs, and try to head that in a new direction where we're not leading to more and more congestion per se, but giving people better options for giving them the options of living out. You can still find a house in the county or further afield. Those aren't going to go away. But moving forward, you can see greater numbers of homes near transit with a hope and expectation that it's going to allow people to get around without having to drive cars. But it's not going to happen overnight.
Right. So what is the city doing, planning for this? Because like you said, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long time to bring employers or work with the current employers that we have in the city to hire more local people, or to probably build their workforce. Are we going to be working together with them as well?
This is not necessarily an economic development strategy per se, as a way to remove barriers to developers who want to put housing, to want to put jobs in urban areas. So now the traffic component is no longer an obstacle and for being challenged in court. So that's been a huge challenge for a number of developments all across the state in any number of communities, where if you're going into downtown Berkeley and you want to do a mid-rise apartment complex, one of the ways to challenge it is to go after the traffic study. That goes away. So it's a way to help allow for those kind of developments. It doesn't say that you have to do it, of course.
The other thing we're working on, and that's great points, is the downtown specific plan, and we're also starting on amendments to the Manabiao specific plan to try and. I'm going to have to get water now too. I'm coughing. To try and bring that mixed use of commercial and residential.
Yeah, and again, the downtown specific plan, I'm remiss for not plugging that, because we will have our next advisory committee meeting coming up on Thursday, March 26th. It's open to the public. Anybody is welcome to come and share their views. There's going to be a series of these moving forward. It's both a visioning exercise and a regulatory document. So it sets out the land use patterns that the community would like to see happen along particularly Main Street and other areas in the community, how much we want to build up, what densities or intensities, to use the D word. Hopefully this is a safe place for that. And what mixed uses, all these sort of things are then turned into regulations. What are permitted? What are sort of the development standards that we want to accommodate, say, parking, for example? At what ratios? And then how do we create a more vibrant downtown? So you look at the public realm. What are the street furniture? What are street trees? What's the interface between the buildings and the sidewalks to foster cafes, for example, or any number of things that foster an environment where people want to visit, spend their time, spend their tax dollars for that matter, find places to work and places to live.
That meeting is the 26th of March in the evening in the library, is that?
This time it's going to be in the library. Last time it was in the community room, so don't go to the community room. Go to the library, second floor, facing out onto Main Street. There's a conference room.
In time?
I believe it is set for 5 p.m.
Okay.
And there should be some light refreshments, so you won't starve.
Any other questions? Well, thank you. Madam Secretary, are you taking over for nominations and election of Planning Commission chairperson? Oh, I'm sorry, we skipped the consent agenda. You can have another minute. Okay, are there changes that need to be made to the minutes, or is there a motion to approve the minutes for January and February?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
Should we call for a vote, please?
Acosta?
Yes.
Hammer?
Yes.
Rodriguez?
Yes.
Sarmiento?
Yes.
Tavares?
Yes.
Jones?
Yes.
Beach Olson?
Yes.
The motion passed.
Okay, now new business.
All right. Great. So now we move to 5A, nominations and election of Planning Commission chairperson. And I will open up the nomination period. If anyone would like to nominate someone for chair, please do so now.
I'd like to nominate Matt Jones for chairperson.
I'll second that.
You have any other nominations? Going once, going twice. I will open this up for public input. If any member of the public would like to speak on the nomination of Matt Jones for chairperson, please do so now. Seeing nothing, we'll bring it back. Any comments, anything before the vote?
I agree with the nomination. I believe that he's been very good for the commission, and I like the mentality that he brings to the commission, and his viewpoints are always well spoken, and I think he is definitely somebody that can lead the Planning Commission in the right direction that Jenny has done so since I've been on the commission.
Great.
All of you. Thank you.
All right. With that, I'll ask for a roll call.
Acosta?
Here, yes.
Hammer?
Yes.
Rodriguez?
Yes.
Sarmiento?
Yes.
Tavares?
Yes.
Beach Olson?
Yes.
Jones?
Yes.
A motion
That would
passed.
have been embarrassing.
All right. Great.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to, before we play musical chairs, we move on to, nominations and election of a Planning Commission vice chairperson. So I'll open up the nomination period.
I'd like to nominate Ed Acosta.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any other nominations?
I'd like to nominate Jenna Rodriguez.
Is there a second? I don't see a second on that. So we've got Ed Acosta nominated for vice chair.
I'd like to nominate Commissioner Kammer as the vice chair.
And I'd like to second that.
Surprise! All right. Anything else? Anyone? I will open it up to public, public input. If anyone has anything to say regarding the nominations for vice chair. Seeing none, I will return to commission. I guess we will, discussion. Let's do that. Let's discuss. Any comments, discussion, anything amongst commissioners?
I think attendance is a big part of the nomination, and Commissioner Kammer is definitely here at the majority of the meetings. She also has many things to bring in terms of the discussion and many questions. I also know that she's very involved with things that the city is trying to promote, such as cycling and pedestrian safety, and I just think that she would bring a lot of enthusiasm to the position.
I'll support Commissioner Kamner as well. I really appreciate the attention to detail that she brings to all of our discussions. I know that she has previously served in this role and did a lovely job at it, and so I would be happy to support her going forward in serving in this way again.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I admire you coming always with questions and very organized and thoughtful about the agenda and what our discussions are about. And I've learned a lot in my short time here because of you, so I want to thank you for that as well.
Thank you very much for all of your lovely comments. I really appreciate it.
So should we do first a roll call for Commissioner Acosta as vice chair? No? Okay. All right.
You voice vote, so she's going to call our name, and then you say which person by name.
I'm going to take the voice vote. Please.
Okay, just to clarify, so I'm only going to be taking, okay, so the voice vote, and then they'll just say who they vote for. Okay, all righty. Acosta?
Oh, no, I think
No.
call each of the commissioners and they'll say who they're.
Right. And
Right.
she-
he's
so,
first.
So
she-
she's
she-
called.
Yeah.
she called-
Oh, okay, sorry.
Acosta.
Okay. Hammer?
Kammer.
Rodriguez?
Kammer.
Sarmiento?
Acosta.
Tavares?
Kammer.
Jones?
Acosta.
Beach Olson?
Kammer.
So Kammer had 4 votes. So the motion passed for Kammer as vice chair.
Thank you.
Great, and now we can move seats. Thank you. And I will pass the meeting over to Chair Jones. It was nice seeing you.
One over.
Okay.
Here? Good thing you didn't break the chair today, because I'm sitting in that chair now.
Okay, next year.
you can come to the party.
Put my feet up.
Hey, I like, yeah, that's.
And I lower that, right? Oops. The wrong one.
Can I say something? So I remember I've been on the commission for 6 years, and I remember when Jenny Sarmiento, you were chair and you were absent, and we didn't know until I got in here, and Susie Miriam said, and I was vice chair, so you were chair and I was vice chair, and I came in and Susie says, "You're chair today." I'm like, she goes, "It's okay, I'll help you." So definitely was. It's much easier when you've been on the commission for a while to get all this, organized. So thank you again.
And I'd like to just say something. First of all, thank you all for the nomination and the vote. I would also like to thank Genevieve Olson for her leadership over the last year. It's been a lot of fun, and I think you did an outstanding job. So thank you. Yeah, I know. Okay, so now I guess we are moving on to the public hearing. Item number 6, an application for a special use permit with environmental review to allow the construction of a new telecommunications facility at an existing mini warehouse storage facility, extra space storage, located at 1478 Freedom Boulevard. And I guess now we are going to hear the staff reports.
Good evening, Planning Commission. My name is Sarah Weichel, and I'm an assistant planner. And tonight we will be discussing application for a special use permit with environmental review to construct a new unmanned telecommunications facility at 1478 Freedom Boulevard. For the staff report, I will be providing a brief overview about the project location, the proposed project, including a brief discussion of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, as well as Watsonville Municipal Code Chapter 14-35 on telecommunications uses to frame the discussion of staff review and the process for staff review of a telecommunications facility within Watsonville. Then there will be a brief discussion on conditions of approval associated with the projects and the findings required to support the permit, specifically findings for telecommunication uses and special use permit findings. The project site is 1478 Freedom Boulevard. It is located in the thoroughfare commercial zone and has a general plan designation of general commercial. The existing site is developed with an existing mini warehouse storage facility, extra space storage. Adjacent to the site and across the street from Freedom Boulevard are various commercial uses. Additionally, there's an institutional use next to the site, Oddfellows Cemetery, and towards the rear of the site is multiple residential high-density uses. The requested entitlements are a special use permit with environmental review. Pursuant to Watsonville Municipal Code Section 14-16.1203B, the district regulations allow for a telecommunications facility with the issuance of a special use permit in the thoroughfare commercial zone. Additionally, the project will have environmental review in accordance with CEQA, so a categorical exemption will be prepared. The proposed project is, again, new construction of an unmanned 75-foot tall telecommunications facility at an existing mini warehouse storage facility. The project includes 12 antennas and accessory equipment to be housed within an existing storage unit to help screen and enclose the associated equipment. The telecommunications facility will be enclosed by a 6-foot fence, and the telecommunications facility, again, is incorporating a monopine design utilizing stealth technology to help screen the antennas from public right-of-way. So on the left for the PowerPoint, you will see an equipment plan. In the center of that dashed circle is where the telecommunications facility will be placed. And then adjacent to that is the existing storage unit that is going to be housing the accessory equipment associated with the telecommunications facility. The applicant is also proposing taking away the roll-up door and putting in a man door to, again, restrict access and secure the area. And to the right, you will see partial elevations of the site. And you can see, again, the adjacent to the telecommunications facility is the existing storage facility, again, enclosed by a 6-foot fence and protective bollards to protect the site and to enclose it. To help contextualize our discussion about telecommunications facilities, I want to briefly touch on the Telecommunications Act of 1996 and Watsonville Municipal Code Chapter 14-35 on telecommunications uses. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 does allow states and local governments to make decisions regarding placement, construction, and modification of telecommunication facilities, and there's additional documentation and guidance that helps provide the framework for the processing approval of telecommunications related applications. And then the local framework that we're working within is Watsonville Municipal Code Chapter 14-35 on telecommunications uses. In the chapter specifically, I'm going to touch on the development standards for telecommunications facilities and the submittal requirements that the applicant has to abide by in order to process the application. For the development standards for telecommunications facilities, there are maximum height requirements. There are required setbacks from residential zones, and the applicant worked closely with staff to meet those separation requirements, which are 2 times the height of the proposed facility. So the facility is proposed to be 75 feet tall, so the separation requirement from residential is 150 feet, and the proposed project does meet their requirement. There is also required separation between telecommunications facilities, and lastly, there are design standards to consider for a telecommunications facility. So those design standards include screening through the use of stealth technology. So again, that's why there is a monopine type design before you this evening, in addition to the use of the storage unit to screen the accessory equipment from public view. Additionally, the applicant did provide various other documents that I will go through briefly, including an alternative site analysis, which discusses why the proposed site at 1478 Freedom Boulevard is before us this evening. Additionally, there will be they provided visual simulations of what the monopine telecommunications facility look like from adjacent areas. There was a search ring analysis provided that substantiates why the facility, that helps substantiate the height proposed of the facility and the amount of antennas. Additionally, an engineering firm provided a radio frequency analysis to make sure that the proposed facility is complying with FCC requirements for electromagnetic radiation from the facility. And lastly, there's an independent analysis by a qualified consulting firm that analyzes all the submittal requirements to, again, make sure that the submittal before you is needed by an independent firm. It's not just the applicant's submittal materials, but there's a qualified firm looking at the submittal documents. So the alternative site analysis the applicant provided discussed that the area of interest for the proposed telecommunications facility, or again, co-location opportunity, would be the area between Freedom Boulevard and Alta Vista Avenue. The applicant did look for co-location alternatives and determined that there were no co-location areas within the sphere of the area of interest, which is why they're proposing the new site build. So looking at the PowerPoint on the left-hand side is the current coverage map, and the blue is areas that don't have reliable service. And then the green and the yellow are in building and in vehicle service. And then the proposed coverage from the primary site location does show the build, and there is an increase in service that the applicant is trying to provide in that region. The applicant also provided visual simulations. These visual simulations were prepared by Advanced Sims, and they provided visual simulations from nearby residential areas. So as you can see on the left-hand side, on the top is the existing without the proposed telecommunication facility, and the bottom is the proposed where the telecommunications facility is present. And the first photos are from Arista Lane, and then the second set of photos are from Atkinson Lane at Arista Court. And again, the existing and proposed from the corner of Atkinson Lane and Freedom Boulevard. And then lastly, visual simulations from Freedom Boulevard near Oddfellow Cemetery. The search ring analysis shows, again, each photo shows different heights of the proposed telecommunication facility. So the first image on the top left is the existing coverage. As we move towards the right, the first depiction is from the telecommunications facility at a proposed height of 35 feet. The next depiction is at 45 feet. And then if we go towards the bottom on the left, that is at the telecommunications antennas at 55 feet. And lastly, the full build out, and this is from the antenna height being at 67 feet. The radio frequency emissions compliance report was prepared by Waterford Consultants and determined that the proposed project would not expose members of the general public to hazardous levels of RF energy at the ground level or in adjacent buildings, and that the conclusions and determinations in the report show that this energy does not exceed any of the FCC standards. And excuse me. And lastly, an independent analysis was conducted by Global RF Solutions. So every new telecommunications facility does have to go through an independent analysis of submittal materials, which looks at all of the documentation that I just explained to you and comes to a conclusion about the overall submittal and the need for the submittal. The analysis concluded that the proposed site should improve the quality of services in the areas identified as needing improvement and assist in addressing current demands in that location. Next, this is just a brief selection of the conditions of approval, but conditions that staff wanted to notify Commission about is that the applicant is required to comply with all FCC requirements. The applicant is also required to incorporate the radio frequency report recommendations, including signage to notify climbers or any technicians working at the facility of any hazardous conditions located near the telecommunications facility, and also that there must be restricted access to the telecommunications facility. And lastly, the applicant is also required to provide co-location opportunities to other carriers. So that means that Verizon Wireless or other types of telecommunications carriers can co-locate at that facility. And that is a requirement for all new telecommunications built within the city limits. So based on the staff report, the Planning Commission may make the required special use permit and telecommunication uses findings in support of the new telecommunications facility. And staff recommendation is that Planning Commission adopt a resolution approving a special use permit application with environmental review, planning permit 2019-301, to allow the construction of a new telecommunications facility at an existing mini warehouse storage facility, extra space storage, located at 1478 Freedom Boulevard in Watsonville, California, APN number 019-226-13. And that concludes the staff report.
So, questions for staff? Sorry.
Go ahead. I'll let you go first.
Okay. Can you go back to the map, the coverage map, with the 5 height, please? Okay. Because ours, it's easier to see it with the colors than the black and white. Okay, I didn't have a question. I just wanted to see this one again. So thank you.
You're
I
welcome.
Just wanted to check it out. I just
Yeah, sometimes
it's
the black
just
and white's a
easier
little hard to see.
like it's easier to see the coverage differences from here than it is here. So thank you.
You're
okay,
welcome.
I'm finished.
Commissioner Acosta, did you have a question?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I spent a lot of years in telecom, so one of the questions I have is, were part of the condition of approval any sort of report or working with the FAA, meaning the airport, for the amount of boosted signal that we're going to be getting over that particular area? Is that area in a flight path? Is that area at all in danger of having signal or navigational signals interrupted by this additional boost in wireless signal?
If I can try and answer that, or the applicant, perfect.
Hello. Okay, good. It is already on. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Sarah King. I work for Epic Wireless Group, who's here. I'm basically representing the applicant AT&T this evening. Thank you very much for your time this evening. I also want to thank Sarah. She's been fantastic just helping us work through the process, the application, sorting through what documents were needed. In terms of the FAA, what I can verify is AT&T for all their sites goes through both an FCC and an FAA application process, and essentially just verifies that it's part of their compliance procedure is they have an entire team set up to ensure that they're meeting federal requirements, which includes FAA getting a chance to look at it, ensure we're not in a flight path, and asking us for recommendations. Given the height of this tower, I wouldn't anticipate that they'll trigger anything. I think we're low enough. Usually when you start getting up to like 200-foot towers and things like that, you tend to start ending up in flight paths, and you might get a light on the top or painted, or if you're within a few miles of an airport, even shorter towers can trigger. But in this case, I don't anticipate we'll have any particular issues with FAA, but we will file.
Okay, wonderful. Also, is this location going to be a backhaul site, or is it?
No, this one will be fiber, so it will be.
So it is.
hard.
It is using fiber backhaul.
Yes, yes, just not microwave backhaul. Sorry, backhaul
Sorry,
usually
gotcha.
refers.
Right. So in that case, not only does this tower need to be constructed, are you tapping into an existing backhaul ring, or are you going to be placing a new one, and will that ring be aerial, or will that be underground?
I'm not sure I'm following the terminology there. We will be basically pulling fiber from the street. There is currently active fiber lines there, trenching it in and feeding it into the tower.
Okay, and is that part of this approval packet? So there'll be a separate. Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Matt, I do have a question, or maybe a comment first. So, just for full transparency, I know that Independence Square is close to the facility itself, or the tower itself, and I am on the board of directors for the Independence Square, but that's not what this is about. I just want to make a comment with regards to notification. I understand that there was notification to neighborhoods in the in the area, in the general vicinity, and some of the mailings that went out were received on Monday, dated February 20th. Is that correct? They were received Monday, so that doesn't give the community much time to be able to attend this meeting or even respond to what's occurring here. Anyone?
Notices get sent out 10 days before the hearing, so I don't know why they would have received it on Monday.
Monday the 2nd.
Yeah.
So it's yesterday.
Any other comments from the commissioners?
Is there an applicant presentation?
You actually have a presentation?
No, I took, Sarah was kind enough to provide me with hers. I took a look at it, and I figured rather than rehashing some details, she did an excellent job laying it out, so I kind of went rather than go through it all again just to repeat, I'd refrain. So, but I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has any curiosities or concern areas. I'm certainly happy to address those.
Thank you. Any questions for the applicant?
I
we have a
do.
question.
Would you quickly talk about how the co-location process works? And I'm assuming that this tower would then have that space available?
Yes, AT&T actually does a really excellent job. They plan for co-location. They assume at some point all carriers are going to come, the full list of carriers will come interested in their towers. In that case, they actually do prepare their foundation is built up to spec to basically handle the loading, and they try and get that all in when they do the first initial build. And that way, the hope is, of course, that as new carriers come along, they throw additional equipment on, that additional weight won't require modification to the tower, won't require drop-in swaps where they actually have to remove the tower and put up a new one and make major modifications to it. Their goal is to make sure that should, for example, Verizon come along and take an interest in this tower, that they can essentially just throw their equipment up there, throw their ground space down, and forge ahead without any significant impact to the local area and to the property owner. So co-location is definitely a prize thing for them. They understand that pretty much all the jurisdictions at this point are encouraging that as a habit. And so they're trying to make sure that they accommodate that to the best of their ability. In terms of the process in general, I can speak to it mostly from how it happens when I find a location to co-locate on. Is essentially what happens is AT&T looks to my company, assigns us an area where they're interested in placing a tower, and then I'll go out and I'll actually look for any existing facilities. Say I look in the area, I find there's a Verizon tower. What I'll do is I'll actually reach out directly to Verizon. We have kind of standard forms of communication. The carriers in particular have figured out that it makes a certain amount of sense to keep those communications open. And once you reach out, then it becomes a negotiation. We just develop a lease, and co-locating's almost always preferable to any of the carriers. It's infinitely cheaper, not having to do a whole brand new build tower, and much quicker. You know, the permitting process can run a year and a half to get a new build, where co-location, you can drop it down to roughly 6 months. So yes, co-location will definitely be a focus of this tower, as it is with all their towers, and we'll certainly be happy to look if Verizon and any other carriers, T-Mobile, is interested. We're happy to take a look at that.
Thank you.
So any other questions for the applicant?
I'll go ahead and ask about coverage. So in the 55-foot pole that I see on the slide, the coverage, and then when it goes to 67 feet, there doesn't seem to be a huge difference, whereas from the 45 to the 55, that seems to be a bigger coverage area. Can you talk about why?
Yeah, that's an assortment of factors. Some of it's, this one probably a little less topography, but that may have something to do with it. I don't know the exact layout for the region around it. But there's generally two things that will impact coverage. Is topography is the signal can only has limited ability to travel over or through solid earth. So if you have a hill or something nearby, then it can create a shadow. That's probably less true in this case. I don't believe there are any major topographic features in this area, but there's probably a little bit of rolling variation, which may cause that kind of variation as you get that extra 10 feet can make a bigger difference in some jumps than others. The other one's vegetation, is if the signals, especially if it's going immediately into trees, if it's traveling through enough vegetation, it actually just weakens the signal and basically just makes it travel less distance.
Thank you.
Applicant? Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome.
Appreciate it. So Planning Commission clarifying or technical questions? None. I will move to public hearing. Is there anyone from the public who would wish to comment on this topic? Please state your name and address for the record. There it is. Now it's on.
All right. Victor Moran, I'm with Wattsville Neighbors. Congratulations on your new chairmanship and vice chairmanship. And I appreciated hearing from Jenny about the women's event. I'm going to try to take my mom 4 o'clock, right, on Friday. think it's great. You're doing great work with the Women's Commission, so thank you very much. Another quick housekeeping thing. Anna, you mentioned the National Night Out. Last year, you guys had a planning commission meeting scheduled on that day, and you sort of had to abruptly cancel your meeting. So you might want to look at your calendar and just make sure.
That night is always our commission meeting's canceled.
So
it's always canceled.
I'm just letting you know, you had a couple cancellations last year. You might want to look at some of those community events, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. As far as this particular item, Watsonville Neighbors is very concerned. This is our year 2020 is sort of being all about transparency and public notifications and making sure that everyone in the community has a fair advance notice of things. There's been a feeling that things are kind of being rushed through at the last minute or not being fully vetted with the community, and people aren't getting a fair shake at what's going on. So as far as the commentary about the notification of the 10 days, I know we did get an extra day this year, February 29th, but if you're looking at a letter being mailed, let's say on the 20th or 21st of February, it doesn't really get received at a minimum to the 24th, which is Monday. So even if you're being generous, there's 5 days plus 3, that's 8. It's really not 10 days notification. Notification is one of those things in the law, and I know Mr. Smith is there. He can give you the legal stuff. But if you don't have adequate notification, people can appeal that and make the applicant go through the process again. As far as when this kind of came out to the general public, and you can confirm this with Mr. Nunez in the back, didn't actually go online as a story till yesterday. So there are people out there that are very interested in what you do. The reason why many of them aren't here is maybe they're not being adequately notified. So I really want you to take heed of that and look into that and maybe think about that as you vote. Notice I'm not bringing up other things that aren't part of what you're supposed to be doing, I guess. But this is something that's very important. Normally there's notification, people put something out there and they send a letter and they're very transparent about the whole process. The other thing is, as far as the airport stuff goes, it's not always a height deal. There's times where there's flight paths, there's signals, radio signals and different things that can interfere. You just saw recently about the lasers being used. So it probably wouldn't be a bad idea in the future is to have a category FAA checklist, maybe have a local airport, Ray Vaughn or somebody, check it off and say it's good to go. I know my time is up.
Yes, thank you.
But I just wanted to put those out there in the public hearing as an official part of this process. Thank you.
And thank you for comments. Any other public comments? Seeing none, I will bring it back to the Planning Commission for deliberation. Sorry, appropriate motion.
I move that we approve staff recommendation.
Is there a second?
Second.
So we now have an active motion to approve staff recommendations. Is there any other deliberation amongst the Planning Commission regarding this? Seeing none, I will ask for a roll call vote.
Acosta?
No.
Rodriguez?
Yes.
Sarmiento?
Yes.
Tavares?
Yes.
Beach Olson?
Yes.
Hammer?
Yes.
Jones?
Yes.
Motion passed.
One of the things I wanted to cover before we move on to the report of the Secretary was just that what got brought to light during this last week was how important what we do up here at the Planning Commission really is, and the true magnitude of the responsibility that we have as planning commissioners. And so before we move on to the report of the Secretary and the adjournment, I would actually just encourage, if you haven't already, read the city charter and the section regarding the Planning Commission. The city charter is our Constitution. and it says exactly what we have the responsibility for and the scope and authority to enact and enable. So that was just something I wanted to encourage my fellow commissioners to do if you haven't already done it. And now, I guess we will move on to the report of the Secretary.
Thank you. I believe when I stepped out to get some water, Justin, you gave information on the Downtown Specific Plan Advisory Committee.
Yes, but it doesn't hurt to repeat that. It's coming up at the end of March,
That's
Thursday.
right. I came back in, I'm like, library, second floor, he must be talking about the Downtown Specific Plan. So the next advisory committee meeting will be March 26th. It will be in the library meeting room, and we will keep you posted on the exact time of that meeting. We're going to be bringing to you in the near future a study session on the upcoming additional dwelling unit ordinance modifications. There's so many bills that came down that were passed by the state last year that we are finally going to be updating our ordinance, and just want to go through all the major changes and the big shifts that the state's requiring before we bring it finally to you for consideration. And I think that's about it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah,
I
please.
want to thank you, Susie, for providing us with the city council updates, for putting us on that list for the city council updates, because it's
very welcome.
always good to know what's going on in town, right? Oh, look at that. Gee whiz.
Okay, great.
So,
Yes.
yeah, so thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Great. And then I will bring us to adjournment. Thank you. See you all next month.